Hey everybody, this is Perch. We got a mail here, listener question. This says, howdy Perch, I'm a fairly recent listener on the channel. Come to you by way of Zach. Make of that what you will. However you make of that. Is it worse than coming from YouTube's search engine? I mean, that thing's the worst. By the way, YouTube, Gmail, Google, I get very frustrated with the sloppiness of their programs. And I'm on YouTube, and definitely, last time I was bitching about YouTube was when they weren't paying me properly. They kind of fixed that, but they're still not doing a good job of it. But I happened to notice that right about that time, my videos stopped getting recommended as much. It's weird. Anyway, in Gmail, a bunch of mail goes into the spam or promotions, folder, and I never look in there because, why would you? It's marked spam. I'm not going to go digging around in there. And sure enough, I look in there, and there's tons of viewer questions in there. Meanwhile, spam is just coming into the regular inbox. So what are you even doing? What are you doing, Google? Anyway, back to the mail. It says, your comics as a business approach has been very enlightening and provided a lot of insider information on why the industry is the way it is. And there have been, I think, some very astute observations from you and some of your listeners about things that might be done to get the industry moving in the right direction. The ideas of using a format like a manga tankobon to get comics onto more shelves in an affordable way, and following the manga to anime back to manga model for the audience with one feeding the other struck me. But then a storm cloud loomed, emanating also from one of your videos. What, if anything, can the comics audience do to push the industry to take up those corrective measures, or any corrective measure for that matter? If, as you said, the creators much of the time don't or won't understand what the readers are unhappy about, the creators can't even find out whether their books sell well or poorly and are even lied to about it sometimes. The higher-ups at Marvel and DC are too busy with movies and merchandising to worry about comics and keeping them on the shelves at places like Five Below, and the indies are chasing Netflix and movie deals. What can actually be done to break through? Sean Murphy was recently interviewed by Mark Miller and mentioned trying to convince the people at DC to sell a shrunk-down black and white newsprint tankobon format edition of Batman White Knight and being shrugged off by them. He also mentioned that on the interview on my channel. It is a good idea. Even the bare minimum. Somebody must have also suggested you do that idea. Anyway, even the bare minimum advice coming from top tier talent is falling on deaf ears. And Sean Murphy. No, I'm just kidding, Sean. I'm just kidding. You would think that they would be tired of having their lunch eaten by Dogman, the Babysitter's Club, and My Hero Academia. Is the answer to just stop buying altogether and starve them until it's unsustainable? After movies and merchandise, are comics themselves even a big enough part of Marvel and DC's revenue stream that they would notice? The answer is no, by the way. Hope this isn't too much of a bummer email, and I've really enjoyed your commentary. I've just been stumped by the question, how do you get these people to do anything? It's a great question. First off, know your audience. So look, okay, if the premise here is how do we get the comic industry to do things that are in its best interest? And I'm excluding any of the social storytelling, woke, not woke stuff for the moment. I'm purely talking about distribution, what you mentioned with Sean Murphy, the tankobon format, better marketing, etc. Those things. First off, the people you want to talk to are definitely not the creators. The creators have zero say in it. And as you point out yourself, Sean Murphy is a creator. It's one of DC's higher selling, more notable creators. Definitely somebody that they like and want to keep going with. In his suggestions of hey, why don't we just sell comics this way? Why don't we try and put this format out? Get shrugged off. So if you spend your time talking to, I was seeing somebody yell at Gail Simone. It's why don't you change the way the comic books are sold? Gail has absolutely fuck all to do with any aspect of this. It's nothing. That'd be it would be as valuable, quite frankly, as you going to your local Arby's and just telling the person behind the counter there, why don't you make edible food? That person's not responsible for any of this. You're wasting your time. You're absolutely wasting your time in that world. Doesn't mean you shouldn't still push. Of course you should still push, but push the right people. For those decisions, you are looking for people who are full-time employees, definitely not creators. And generally, you're looking at people who are either senior editors. I mean, you're talking, Jordan White would have some sway. Tom Brevoort would have much more. But really, you're needing to get to Dan Buckley and David Gabriel and names like that. CB Smolsky, yeah, to some extent. Put it this way: if you at least are talking to CB Smolsky about Tonkaman style books or food, you're probably getting into a zone where he will listen to you and knows at least what you're talking about. He can call up his friend Akira Yoshida or whoever it was, who can also weigh in on kind of what this stuff feels like. No pun intended. Anyway, but the reality is so if there's any hope of success, first of all, you got to get your feedback to somebody who actually has a remote chance of doing something with it. And so that's somebody in those other zones. But it's a high likelihood that those people are going to largely ignore you. And why are they ignoring you? It's not because you're a loser or that they're stuck. It's for a kind of almost a sad reason. And that's I'll explain it to you this way. Do you have kids? But you listening to this, if you don't, imagine you do. But if you have kids, then you'll be able to immediately kind of know what I'm talking about. Do you give your kids an allowance? If you do they work for that allowance? So there's a number of, my wife and I have various other parents we talk to. And one time, one of the parents we were with, his parent group, one of the parents we were talking to is like, I can't get our kid, like they're asking, like, your kids, your kids seem to clean up their rooms. And, how'd you get them to do that? I'm like, well, when we give them an allowance, when we give them money, they have to do work in order to get the allowance. If they don't do the work, they don't get the money. And the parents like, oh, we just give them an allowance because we get tired of them asking us to buy them things. So we just give them money, but there's not any, there's no real strings or chores attached to it. And this is pretty common. A number of parents do this. They basically give their children a stipend. Well, what does this have to do with comics? Well, if you're Marvel and DC and you're an exec there, you're making six figures. You're probably making, bonuses, incentives, and depending on where you live, you're making good money. Many of the senior people are making at least $250,000 in base, usually higher. Several of the executives, it is public information. You can see that like people were paid, seven figures, in some cases, eight figures. Okay, so that's more than 10 million if you're counting at home. The person paying you that is Papa Disney or Papa Warner or AT&T or however it all comes down. And if that's your money and you're getting that, and your performance is you're not really inventing anything, you're not moving the needle. Nobody's sitting down at the end of the year and going, hey, did we increase sales 20% or any of that? If you're just given that money and say, go for it, then a lot of people will behave like, the children I was talking about. They'll just, they won't clean their room because why should they? Why bother? There's no need to. There's no incentive to, unless you happen to get somebody who's a true believer who believes that the room should be clean or that the comics should be, we should be innovating in terms of comics. The stuff that's going to get you a raise or a bonus or promoted is going to be corporate synergy inside the company. Or if you're able to strike some kind of partnership deal, like, hey, look at this, we got a deal with Fortnite. Fortnite's popular. We got a Fortnite deal. If you do that, that's going to get the attention of executives. If you say, hey, we put out a Tonkaban version of White Knight, and we sold 20,000 copies through there, and got some additional stuff, and the bottom line, basically, instead of bringing in 86 million in profit this year, you're bringing in 86.5 million. It's not going to matter. And if you've been trained for several years and your predecessors were trained this way, and the entire kind of culture and ecosystem is trained to just, you're going to get your money no matter what. Yeah, what do you think is going to happen? So that's the problem. So if your question is how do you crack through that? Well, you've got to figure out, first of all, stop thinking about logic and what the right thing to do is. Those are just distractions. And instead kind of wrap your head around, how do I trick this person into believing that making these kinds of changes are going to result in more money, promotion, job security, whatever it happens to be. How do I make it about them? Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, and I've dealt with a lot of executives in my time, a lot of C-suite people, You have to make it relevant to them. One of the negative parts about Marvel and DC, I would say, is that unlike a startup or a company where they don't have kind of a parent giving them the money, even movement in stock and that kind of, I mean, they're not accountable. So I will tell you, Bob Iger goes home at night and does think, how can I move the needle and make my share price increase as a company? He's at the top. He wants to get that bonus payout for the board. He wants to, be able to leave as a champion of business and have those bragging rights. That's what he wants. So he is going to worry about that. But if you're, up until a few months ago, because he's been let go of Joe Quesada. If you're Joe Quesada, what do you dream about? Moving the share price up on Marvel doesn't have shares. It's part of Disney. No matter how much, even if he 20x the revenue in his business, even if they took it from whatever, like 100 and I forget, like 120 to, 1.5 billion, still going to be fairly insignificant in Disney's coffers. And there's no way that the comic industry can grow 10x in 1 year. There's no way. So you have to basically trick these guys into going, hey, if you do this, it's going to mean marketing. It's going to mean you're going to get some PR. Somebody's going to come and talk to you about it. You're going to get interviewed. It's going to be good for your LinkedIn profile. It's good for your career. You have to kind of go that direction. You have to figure out what is it that's going to motivate and move these people. And quite frankly, PR, fame is a big one. That's going to do it. Being able to be an innovator. So if you're able to give them an idea they could do first, this is why the suggestion of like, why don't you just do what manga's doing isn't a great one, because in their minds, manga's already done it. So there's no, they're not going to get praise for being an innovator. You might be able to get some, the sympathy vote, if you will, basically going to them and saying, hey, this will allow, there's some creators who are in bad health. And if you print this tankobon version, you'll be able to give them a small royalty and do a little press release and look really good in that process. There's that option where you can kind of, this will be a good thing and you'll wind up looking better. All this sounds very cynical, and the reality is it is. In a normal world, the people involved, the higher ups, would be, pushing, trying to innovate, working as hard as they could, because they would generate money, which would generate value to the company, which would, be good for them. But when you're owned by a giant corporation, a lot of those things fall apart. You no longer have that same driver. And that, unfortunately, is kind of where we are today. That's where things sit. And that definitely creates a complication. So one other suggestion is to not just leave it completely on a down note. One other suggestion is find somebody at a smaller company. And in this case, you're looking at somebody who's willing to listen. So opportunities, Boom would be harder to do this with, but a Mad Cave, a Dynamite, those guys that would be interesting. Try to basically get your idea to one of those, and do some of the legwork. Get one of these smaller companies to do it and help connect the dots for them. And then one of the things that Marvel and DC do is, they typically don't make moves on their own, but they can be kind of shamed into keeping up with others. And so if you can get your idea moving with one of the smaller companies, the big companies will sometimes, copy and then take credit for having the idea in the first place. And that's another way that you can potentially do it. However, you can't use too much reverse psychology, meaning if you get one of the ideas going with a smaller company, you cannot start a campaign of, hey, you dumb, woke, giant corporate suck up jackass, look what you did. If you do too much of that, then, the big company is going to just shun it to its own detriment. So you gotta play that balance well. By the way, it's worth noting, another part of this question is, why are you having to, why try so hard to help out a giant faceless corporation? Well, there's two answers to that. Number one is, hey, we do love comics and we love these characters. And so sometimes you wind up helping somebody you don't necessarily like because you want what's better for your own entertainment for the characters you love. That's reasonable. That's not, embarrassing. I've heard some people make fun of that, like, oh, you shouldn't have any loyalty to the X-Men. Yeah, I hear it, sure. But, if you've been collecting comics for 35 years and you've built up an affinity for these characters, then yeah, you outside of just paying for it out of your wallet, sometimes you want to help people out. The other answer is, yeah, don't. Use these ideas for you. Start your own company. A lot of these things that we want to do to improve the business would work. We know they would work because other groups are doing it. So, you know, it's almost a safe bet. Go for it. Anyway, thanks for listening.